Nathan had long ago concluded that the imperial palace was less a building and more a self-aware organism that breathed, hummed, and occasionally seemed to sigh in boredom. The corridors adjusted their lighting as people passed. Temperature fields shifted subtly to suit individual preferences, and somewhere in the vaulted ceilings, unseen drones whispered back and forth like insects carrying secrets. He walked through one such corridor now, reading a medical report projected faintly above his wrist. The letters hovered in pale blue light, drifting slightly as the palace's artificial gravity made tiny corrections. 3 cases of atmospheric lung irritation, Nathan murmured to himself. One noble complaining that gravity feels heavier than usual, and one ambassador insisting his reflection in the mirror looks tired. He sighed. Being a court physician often meant diagnosing problems that were less biological and more imaginative. A small, hovering assistant drone drifted beside him, its lens blinking. "Shall I prepare a formal explanation regarding the gravitational complaint?" the drone asked politely. "Yes," Nathan said dryly. "Tell him gravity is a universal constant and refuses to negotiate with aristocrats." The drone paused, processing. "I am uncertain whether that response is diplomatic." "It isn't," Nathan said. "That's why I won't actually send it." He flicked the report away, and the projection dissolved into nothing. The corridor opened into a wide balcony overlooking the lower gardens of the palace. Even after years of service, the view still caught his attention. The gardens were not planted in soil, but in suspended terraces of mineral glass, each platform floating gently in the air. Bioluminescent vines spilled over their edges, glowing in soft colors that shifted like slow breathing. Far below, streams of liquid crystal flowed in silent channels, reflecting the sky of the alien world beyond the palace dome. Nathan rested his hands on the railing and watched for a moment. He had learned that pauses like this were necessary. The palace could swallow time if one let it. Footsteps approached behind him. Real footsteps, not the whisper of machines. "Nathan," said a familiar voice, "you look as if you're composing poetry again." Nathan turned to see archivist Lauron, a thin man whose robes seemed permanently covered in dust from centuries-old data vaults. "I was composing a list of complaints," Nathan said. "It lacks rhyme, but makes up for it in frustration." Lauron smiled faintly. "Then you are well suited to court life." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the drifting terraces. Finally, Lauron spoke again, more quietly. "Have you heard about the princess?" Nathan glanced at him. "Everyone has heard about the princess. No one seems to know anything." Lauron folded his hands behind his back. 2 years, he said. "She has not spoken a word in 2 years." Nathan nodded. Rumors traveled quickly in the palace, faster than official communications. He had heard fragments. An incident, a diplomatic disaster narrowly avoided, a young royal who simply stopped speaking. "Many physicians have examined her," Lauron continued. "Neurologists, psychologists, xenobiologists. Even a specialist who claimed to communicate with patients through harmonic resonance." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "And?" "He left after 3 days, Lauron said. "He said she listened politely but refused to resonate." Nathan chuckled softly. "A wise patient." Lauron gave him a curious look. "You don't sound surprised." "I'm a physician," Nathan said. "If someone refuses to speak, it usually means they have a reason. Silence is rarely an illness by itself." They watched a flock of small maintenance drones sweep across the terraces in perfect formation, polishing the mineral surfaces until they gleamed like still water. "She walks in the gardens at dawn," Lauron said after a moment. "Alone." Nathan did not answer immediately. Something about that image lingered in his mind. A silent figure walking among floating lights while the rest of the palace slept. "What does she look like?" he asked finally. Lauron considered. "Like a human woman mostly. But her ears," he gestured vaguely beside his head, "long, graceful, and she moves very quietly, not like someone hiding, more like someone who no longer expects to be heard." Nathan frowned slightly. That was an unusual way to describe a person. A chime sounded softly from the bracelet on his wrist. He glanced down as a message appeared. "Court medical assignment. Physician Nathan Reeve. Primary consultation requested. Patient, Princess Kyreth. Nathan exhaled slowly. Well, he said, that answers one question. Lauron looked at him. You're assigned? Yes. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Lauron said, You know, there are wagers among the staff. Nathan groaned. I don't want to know. Most predict you will last 3 weeks before requesting reassignment. And the optimistic ones? 10 days. Nathan shook his head, laughing quietly. Remind me never to fall ill in this palace. The betting pools alone would kill me. Lauron smiled. Be careful, Nathan. The court has grown used to her silence. Sometimes people become more comfortable with a mystery than with a solution. Nathan looked out over the glowing gardens again. The drifting lights reflected in the dome above, creating the illusion of stars in daylight. I'm not going to solve anything, he said. I'm just going to meet a patient. But even as he said it, he knew that was not entirely true. Something about the idea of a young woman choosing silence in a palace filled with endless voices stirred a quiet curiosity in him. A breeze moved across the balcony, artificial but perfectly tuned, carrying the faint scent of flowering vines. Nathan turned away from the railing. Well, he said, straightening his coat, I suppose I should go meet the most famous silent person in the empire. As he walked back into the corridor, the lights adjusted to follow him, and somewhere deep in the palace, unseen mechanisms shifted, as if the great organism had noticed a new story beginning to unfold. The wing of the palace reserved for the imperial family was quieter than the rest, but not silent. Nothing in the palace was ever truly silent. Soft currents of filtered air moved through invisible vents, energy conduits hummed faintly behind the walls, and distant transport platforms glided with the low whisper of controlled gravity. Nathan followed an attendant through a corridor whose walls were alive with slow-moving constellations. They were not projections, but microscopic light organisms embedded in crystal panels, drifting in patterns that mimicked real star systems. The effect was strangely calming, though Nathan suspected it was designed more for the comfort of anxious visitors than for the residents themselves. Princess Kyreth prefers low-noise environments, the attendant said quietly. Please avoid sudden movements, loud speech, or activating unnecessary devices. Nathan glanced at the small diagnostic scanner in his hand. This counts as unnecessary? The attendant hesitated. If possible. Nathan slipped the scanner into his coat pocket. I promise not to startle her with aggressive medical enthusiasm. The attendant did not appear to know how to respond to that. They stopped before a wide doorway framed in pale metal. No guard stood there, which struck Nathan as unusual. The attendant placed a hand against a sensor, and the door opened without a sound. The chamber beyond was larger than Nathan expected, but almost empty. Sunlight filtered through a high, transparent ceiling, illuminating a garden grown directly into the floor. Real soil, real water, real plants, not the floating terraces of the public grounds, but something quieter, more natural. And near the center of the room, seated on a low stone bench, was Princess Kyreth. Nathan stopped walking. She looked at first glance like any young woman resting in a garden. Her posture was relaxed, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Her hair fell in dark, smooth strands over her shoulders. Only when she turned slightly did he see her ears, long, elegant, tapering gently upward, unmistakably alien, yet strangely harmonious with her features. She did not look fragile. She did not look broken. She looked distant. The attendant stepped forward and bowed slightly. Your Highness, this is physician Nathan Reeve. Kyreth's gaze moved to Nathan. Her eyes were clear, attentive, and entirely silent. Nathan inclined his head politely. Good morning, Princess. No response came, but she continued to look at him, not with indifference, but with a kind of quiet assessment, as if weighing something invisible. The attendant shifted nervously. I will remain nearby, he said, then retreated to the far side of the chamber. Nathan approached slowly, careful not to disturb the stillness of the room. He sat on the opposite end of the stone bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Nathan looked around at the garden. Small insects moved among the leaves, real ones, not mechanical replicas. A narrow stream flowed through the soil, its surface reflecting shifting patterns of light from the ceiling above. "Well," Nathan said after a moment, speaking in a conversational tone, "I must admit this is the most pleasant examination room I've ever seen. Usually my patients insist on sterile walls and the comforting scent of disinfectant." Kyreth did not react, but he noticed the faintest movement in her expression. Not quite amusement, but not indifference either. Nathan leaned back slightly, resting his hands on the bench. "I once treated a nobleman who insisted his medical chamber be filled with the sound of crashing ocean waves. Unfortunately, he lived nowhere near an ocean, so the palace engineers had to build an entire acoustic system just to make him feel dramatic." He glanced sideways at her. He recovered completely the moment the wave stopped. Kyreth blinked slowly, and for an instant Nathan thought he saw the corner of her mouth twitch. Encouraged, he continued, "Another patient refused to speak to me unless I addressed him as Supreme Commander of Cellular Integrity. I'm still not entirely sure what that means." The silence in the garden felt different now. Not heavy, but calm, almost companionable. Nathan studied her discreetly. Her breathing was steady, her posture relaxed, her eyes alert. There was no sign of neurological impairment, no visible tension. Whatever held her silence, it was not something a scanner would detect. He resisted the urge to reach for his instruments. After a while, he said quietly, "You know, I've been told many things about you, Princess. Most of them sound very certain. People always sound certain when they don't understand something." Kyreth's gaze shifted slightly, focusing on a small white flower growing beside the bench. Nathan followed her gaze. "I don't know what happened 2 years ago," he said, "and I won't ask unless you want me to." A breeze moved gently through the chamber, stirring the leaves. Minutes passed. Nathan did not fill the silence. He had learned that silence, when not forced, could be as comfortable as conversation. Finally, he stood. "Well," he said lightly, "I think that concludes the least invasive medical examination in my career." He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at her. "I should say one more thing," he added, almost as an afterthought. "You really do have a remarkable garden. I suspect the plants are better company than most of the court." For the briefest moment, Kyreth's eyes met his again, and this time there was unmistakable warmth in them. Faint but real. Nathan inclined his head and walked toward the door. As it closed behind him, he realized something that made him stop in the corridor for a moment. He had not felt like a physician in that room. He had felt like a guest. Nathan did not return to the princess's chamber for 3 days, not because he was instructed to wait, and not because of any official schedule. The truth was simpler. He wanted the first meeting to remain undisturbed, like a delicate instrument still vibrating after a note had been struck. He had learned long ago that people sometimes needed time more than treatment. On the 4th morning, a message appeared on his wrist display. "Consultation request approved. Patient available. No formal wording, no urgency, no instructions. Just that." Nathan smiled faintly and finished his tea. The liquid inside the cup shimmered faintly. Palace kitchens had recently begun experimenting with suspended herbal infusions that released flavor in stages. Nathan privately suspected this was less about culinary science and more about giving nobles something new to talk about. He set the cup aside and made his way once again to the quiet wing. The corridor seemed even quieter than before. The constellation panels drifted slowly, their lights dimmer, as if morning itself had not fully arrived there. When the door to the garden chamber opened, he saw her standing this time, near the stream, watching the water move. "Good morning, Princess," Nathan said. Kyreth turned her head slightly. Her expression was calm, unreadable, but her eyes recognized him immediately. Nathan walked in and sat on the bench without ceremony. "I'm relieved to see the plants are still alive," he said. "I worried they might have staged a rebellion in my absence." Kyreth looked at him, and this time there was no doubt about it. The faintest hint of amusement passed through her eyes. Nathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I once read a report about a botanical experiment on a research station," he said. "The plants adapted to low gravity so quickly that they began growing toward heat sources instead of light. One morning, the entire laboratory was covered in vines that had wrapped themselves around the coffee machines. He glanced at her. The scientists were less impressed than the plants. For a moment, only the sound of water moving through the stream filled the air. Nathan studied the room quietly. The garden had changed slightly. A few new flowering stems had opened, pale blue petals unfolding like tiny sails. He wondered whether she had planted them recently. "You take care of this place yourself," he said, not as a question. Kyreth gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "That explains why it feels alive," Nathan said. "Most palace gardens feel like decorations that happen to breathe." He fell silent after that, letting the quiet settle naturally. Time passed. He was not sure how long. The palace had ways of bending time in subtle ways, and this room seemed particularly skilled at it. At last, Nathan spoke again, casually, almost absent-mindedly. "I should tell you something," he said, looking at the stream. "When I first heard about you, I expected to meet someone fragile, or distant, or angry with the world." He turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. "I didn't expect to meet someone who seemed composed and very beautiful." The words came out simply, without emphasis, without intention beyond honesty. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then Kyreth's breath caught, so faintly that another person might not have noticed. Her eyes widened, not in shock, but in something closer to disbelief. And then, very softly, she said, "Thank you." The word was quiet, almost fragile, but unmistakably real. Nathan froze. The sound of the stream seemed suddenly louder, as if the entire room had drawn breath at once. Kyreth herself looked startled, as if she had not fully intended to speak. Her hand moved slightly, fingers tightening against the fabric of her sleeve. Nathan did not react immediately. Years of medical training held him still, not wanting to shatter the moment. Finally, he said gently, "You're welcome." That was all. No exclamations, no questions, no calls for attendance. Just a simple answer, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Kyreth looked at him carefully, searching his expression. Perhaps she expected excitement, or curiosity, or the triumphant satisfaction she had seen in so many specialists before. Instead, she found calm. Nathan leaned back slightly, exhaling. "Well," he said lightly, "I suppose that officially makes this my most successful consultation." Kyreth blinked. "I've had patients recover from fever," he continued. "I've even had one ambassador stop arguing with his translator, which many considered medically impossible. But causing someone to say 2 words," he shook his head, "I should probably charge extra." For a moment, Kyreth stared at him. Then unexpectedly, a quiet sound escaped her. Not a word, but something lighter. A laugh. It was brief, almost uncertain, as if the sound itself felt unfamiliar to her. Nathan smiled, not broadly, just enough to acknowledge it. "I should warn you," he said, "if you continue speaking, people may start expecting conversations. It's a dangerous precedent." Kyreth looked down at the stream, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "They already expect too much." Nathan did not answer immediately. The words carried weight, but also clarity. This was not the voice of someone unable to speak. It was the voice of someone who had chosen not to. "I believe they do," he said quietly. They sat in silence after that, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It felt open, like a door that had been closed for a long time and was now just slightly ajar. After a while, Nathan stood. "I won't tell anyone," he said, "about today." Kyreth looked up at him, surprised. "They would only turn it into a spectacle," he added, "and I suspect you've had enough of being studied." For the first time, she met his eyes without reservation. "Yes," she said softly. Nathan kept his promise. For several days, no one in the palace knew that the silent princess had spoken. The attendants noticed nothing unusual. Kyreth still walked the gardens at dawn, still moved through the corridors in quiet composure, still answered questions with the same gentle silence that had become her armor. Only Nathan knew that the silence was no longer absolute. When he returned to her chamber again, the morning light was different, warmer, filtering through high atmospheric lenses that adjusted the spectrum to match the rhythms of the planet outside the dome. The garden smelled faintly of flowering resin trees, a scent both sweet and sharp. Kyreth was seated on the bench when he arrived, watching a small mechanical insect drift over the stream. It hovered carefully, dipping a slender probe into the water to sample mineral content before darting away again. Nathan sat beside her. "I see the palace is still spying on your plants," he said. Kyreth glanced at the insect, then back at him. "They monitor the ecosystem," she said quietly. Her voice was still soft, but steadier than before. Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "Of course, one never knows when a flower might attempt political sabotage." For a moment she simply looked at him, then a faint smile touched her expression. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the water. Finally Nathan said, "You don't have to speak, not for me." Kyreth's fingers traced the edge of the bench. "I know, but you choose to," he said. She was quiet for several seconds, then nodded. "Yes." Nathan watched the stream, letting the quiet stretch naturally. He had learned that forcing conversation was like forcing a wound to close. It only made the healing slower. After a time, Kyreth spoke again. "They used to ask questions," she said. "So many questions." Nathan did not interrupt. "They didn't wait for answers," she continued. "They asked as if the answers already existed somewhere in their reports." Her voice was calm, but there was a faint tightness beneath it, like tension in a wire drawn too thin. "They wanted explanations," she said. "Reasons, diagnoses, predictions." "And you had none to give," Nathan said gently. Kyreth shook her head. "I had too many." Nathan looked at her. For a moment she seemed uncertain, as if deciding whether to continue. Then she exhaled slowly. "When I spoke," she said, "they looked at me with pity, or relief, or fear, but never normally." Nathan understood. Silence fell again, but it was not heavy. It felt like space, wide and open. After a while, Nathan said quietly, "People are uncomfortable with what they can't fix. They prefer problems with instructions." Kyreth looked at him. "And you?" "I prefer patients who don't throw things at me," he said. "My standards are modest." A small laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Nathan smiled faintly. "There was once a general who threw an entire diagnostic console at me because I told him he needed rest." "What happened?" she asked. "I told him he needed rest even more urgently." Kyreth shook her head slightly, amusement lingering in her expression. The tension in the air eased, almost imperceptibly. After some time, she spoke again, more quietly. "I wasn't silent because I couldn't speak." Nathan nodded. "I know. I was silent because speaking meant being seen in ways I did not want." Nathan considered that. "And now?" Kyreth looked at the stream. Sunlight rippled across the water, breaking into fragments of gold. "Now," she said slowly, "I am speaking because I am seen in a way I do not fear." Nathan did not answer immediately. The words settled between them, clear and fragile. At length he said, "That is a rare thing." "Yes," she said. A breeze moved through the chamber, stirring the leaves. Somewhere high above, the faint hum of a passing transport vessel vibrated through the dome. Nathan leaned back slightly. "You know," he said, "if the court discovers that the key to recovery was simply not treating you like a malfunctioning machine, they may be deeply offended." Kyreth raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because it would mean they've been doing it wrong for years," Nathan said, "and nothing terrifies an institution more than being wrong quietly." She smiled at that, an expression small but unmistakably genuine. They sat together in companionable silence. The mechanical insect returned, hovering briefly before darting away again, as if satisfied that the ecosystem remained stable. After a while, Kyreth said, "You are not afraid of silence." Nathan considered the question. "No," he said finally. "Silence is honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything else." She studied him for a moment, as if measuring the truth of that. Then she nodded almost to herself. Time passed without urgency. For the first time in 2 years, Kyreth found that speaking did not feel like stepping into a storm. It felt like stepping into open air. And Nathan, sitting beside her in the quiet garden, realized that he was no longer thinking of her as a patient at all. The days began to develop a rhythm that neither of them spoke about, but both seemed to recognize. Nathan would arrive in the late morning, usually carrying nothing but a small tablet and occasionally a cup of tea he claimed was medicinal but tasted suspiciously pleasant. Kyreth would already be in the garden, sometimes tending the plants, sometimes sitting beside the stream, sometimes simply watching the slow drift of clouds across the inner surface of the palace dome. At first, she spoke only a little, a word, a sentence, sometimes only a quiet answer to something he said. But the words came more easily now, like water finding its path after a long winter freeze. One morning, Nathan arrived to find her kneeling beside a cluster of pale violet flowers, carefully adjusting a narrow band of soil around their roots. "I suspect," he said, sitting on the bench, "that these plants are receiving better medical care than most of my patients." Kyreth glanced at him. "They do not argue about treatment." "That alone makes them remarkable," Nathan said. "I once had a diplomat who refused to take medication unless it was served in a crystal glass and accompanied by music." "What kind of music?" she asked. "Funeral marches," Nathan said. He claimed it improved the seriousness of the dosage. Kyreth let out a soft laugh, brushing soil from her hands. The sound lingered in the air, light and unguarded. Nathan noticed how different her voice sounded now. Not louder, not stronger, but more natural, as if speaking were no longer an effort, but a choice. They sat together for a while, listening to the stream. After some time, Kyreth said quietly, "They have begun to notice." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "The attendants," she said. "They see that I speak to you." Nathan considered that. "And does that trouble you?" She shook her head slightly. "No, only it will not remain quiet forever." Nathan nodded. "Nothing in this palace ever does." A small maintenance drone drifted overhead, projecting a faint lattice of blue light across the garden as it scanned the environment. The plants glowed briefly under the scan, their internal structures momentarily visible like delicate skeletons of light. Kyreth watched the drone pass. "When I was a child," she said, "I used to chase those." Nathan smiled. "I did something similar once. Unfortunately, I chased a diagnostic sphere that was calibrated to avoid obstacles." "What happened?" she asked. "I ran into a wall," he said. "The sphere did not." Kyreth laughed again, and this time the sound came more freely. The moment lingered, warm and unhurried. After a while, Nathan said, "May I ask you something?" She looked at him, cautious but not guarded. "Yes." "You said your silence was a shield," he said. "From pity, from being treated as a problem. But shields are heavy things to carry. Why keep it for so long?" Kyreth's gaze moved to the water. "Because it worked," she said simply. Nathan waited. "When I did not speak," she continued, "people stopped asking questions. They stopped expecting me to be what they needed. Silence created distance. Distance created safety." Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of weariness in it, like someone describing a long journey. "And now?" Nathan asked gently. Kyreth was quiet for a moment. "Now I am learning," she said slowly, "that safety is not the same as living." Nathan felt something tighten in his chest at those words. A breeze moved through the garden, carrying the faint scent of resin blossoms. Above them, the dome shifted its transparency slightly, revealing a glimpse of the pale blue sky of the alien world beyond. Nathan leaned back, resting his hands on the bench. "Living," he said, "is highly overrated in my professional opinion. It involves too much paperwork." Kyreth looked at him, puzzled. "Every time someone survives something dramatic," he continued solemnly, "there are forms, endless forms, reports, follow-up evaluations. I once spent 3 hours documenting a man who swallowed a translation device by accident." "How does someone swallow a translation device?" she asked. "He was arguing while eating," Nathan said. "A dangerous combination." Kyreth shook her head, smiling faintly. The humor softened the air again, easing the weight of their conversation. After a while, footsteps sounded at the edge of the chamber. An attendant approached hesitantly, bowing. "Your Highness," he said, "the council requests confirmation of your attendance at the evening observatory session." Kyreth's expression did not change, but Nathan saw the subtle tension in her shoulders. "I will attend," she said quietly. The attendant bowed again and withdrew. Nathan watched her for a moment. "You don't want to go," he said. Kyreth exhaled slowly. I will have to speak. Yes, Nathan said. You will. She looked at him. And they will watch me. Yes, he said again. Silence settled between them, but it was not the same silence as before. It carried the quiet weight of anticipation. After a moment, Nathan said lightly, if it helps, imagine that everyone in the room is secretly terrified of looking foolish. Kyreth raised an eyebrow. Are they? Almost certainly, Nathan said. It is the one condition that affects all members of the court equally. She smiled faintly at that. They sat together until the light in the garden began to shift toward afternoon, the shadows lengthening, the air cooling slightly as the palace adjusted its climate cycles. At last Nathan stood. You'll be fine, he said simply. Kyreth looked up at him. How do you know? Nathan considered for a moment, then said, because you are not silent anymore. She watched him as he turned to leave, and for the first time in 2 years, the thought of speaking in a room full of people did not feel like stepping into a storm. It felt like stepping into light. The observatory dome rose above the palace like a second horizon, its transparent shell layered with adaptive fields that filtered radiation and sharpened distant starlight until the sky seemed almost impossibly close. At night, the stars were so clear that visitors often reached upward instinctively, as if they might touch them. Nathan arrived later than the council members, deliberately so. He had no wish to stand among them while they whispered their expectations and predictions, like gamblers waiting for dice to fall. The chamber was already filled with low conversation. Nobles in layered fabrics and officers in polished uniforms stood in small clusters, their voices echoing faintly against the curved surfaces of the dome. Holographic projections drifted in the air, displaying orbital paths, stellar winds, and distant trade routes glowing in soft lines of light. Kyreth stood near the center of the room. She was not surrounded, but there was a space around her, a quiet circle that no one seemed willing to cross. People glanced at her, then away, as if uncertain what version of her they might encounter. Nathan moved to a position near one of the support columns, watching quietly. An elderly counselor stepped forward, clearing his throat. Your Highness, he said, his voice formal but cautious, we are honored by your presence. Kyreth inclined her head slightly. Silence stretched for a moment, long enough that several people shifted uncomfortably. Then she spoke. Thank you. The word was simple, but it carried clearly through the chamber. Nathan saw the ripple of reaction move through the room, small, contained, but unmistakable. A few faces showed surprise, others relief, and some a quiet, almost embarrassed uncertainty, as if they were not sure how to behave now that the mystery had changed shape. The counselor blinked, then recovered. We are pleased to see you well, Your Highness. Kyreth did not answer immediately. She looked upward, toward the stars visible through the dome. The sky is clear tonight, she said. It was not an important observation, but it was a beginning. The conversation that followed was cautious, halting at first, like a machine restarting after a long shutdown. Questions were asked, answered briefly, allowed to fade. No one pressed her, and Nathan suspected that word of her gradual recovery had spread quietly enough that the court had been warned not to overwhelm her. After some time, the lights dimmed and the dome shifted to full transparency. The stars blazed into view, sharp and innumerable, a river of light stretching across the darkness. A projection appeared at the center of the chamber, a slowly rotating model of a distant star system, its planets glowing faintly as data streamed around them. Nathan found Kyreth standing beside him. You survived, he said quietly. So did you, she replied. I was never in danger, he said. I spent most of the evening pretending to study stellar charts while actually counting how many people were pretending not to stare at you. And how many were there? She asked. All of them, Nathan said, including me. She gave him a brief, amused look. They stood in silence for a while, watching the projection turn. After a moment, Kyreth said, I thought I would be afraid. And were you? Yes, she said. But not as much as before? Nathan nodded. Fear rarely disappears, he said. It just becomes quieter. A small service drone drifted past, offering glasses of mineral water. Nathan took one and handed another to Kyreth. "To surviving observatory sessions," he said solemnly. She raised the glass slightly. "A rare achievement." They drank, and for a moment the scene felt almost ordinary. Two people standing beneath the stars, sharing a quiet conversation while the machinery of the Empire turned around them. But Nathan felt a subtle tension beneath the calm, something unspoken. "You're thinking about something," he said. Kyreth looked at the projection of the star system, its distant planets glowing like embers. "When I was silent," she said slowly, "time felt suspended. Days passed, but nothing moved. It was like living inside a single breath. And now? Now everything is moving again," she said. "And I am not sure where it is carrying me." Nathan considered that. "Forward," he said finally. "It always does." "That is what I fear," she said quietly. Nathan looked at her, surprised. "Why?" he asked. Kyreth hesitated, then said, "Because forward means change." Nathan smiled faintly. "That is also what makes it interesting." She glanced at him. "You do not seem afraid of change." "I am," he said. "I simply complain about it loudly enough that people mistake it for confidence." Kyreth laughed softly. The sound was lost among the quiet conversations around them, but Nathan heard it clearly. A signal chime sounded, and the projection shifted to display a newly discovered comet, its trajectory arcing across the outer system. Data scrolled beside it: velocity, composition, estimated orbital period. Nathan studied it for a moment. "You know," he said, "comets spend most of their existence in darkness, far from any star. Then once in a very long time, they come close enough to shine." Kyreth looked at the glowing arc of the comet's path. "And then they leave again," she said. "Yes," Nathan said, "but they leave a trail behind them, something that remains." They stood quietly, watching the slow movement of light across the projection. For the first time in many months, Kyreth felt something unfamiliar. Not safety, not distance, but a quiet, tentative hope, like the first faint glow of a star just beginning to rise beyond the horizon. The first light of dawn spread slowly across the inner surface of the palace dome, turning the sky from deep violet to pale gold. The floating terraces below caught the light one by one, their bioluminescent vines dimming as the sun took over the work of illumination. Nathan stood in the garden where he had first met her, watching the stream move quietly over its stones. The water looked different in the morning, clearer, sharper, as if the entire world had been rinsed during the night. He heard footsteps behind him. "You are early," Kyreth said. Nathan turned. She was walking toward him through the garden, the long lines of her silhouette softened by the morning light. There was no hesitation in her stride now, no guarded stillness. She moved like someone who belonged to the world again. "I couldn't sleep," Nathan said. "I kept thinking about a patient." Kyreth raised an eyebrow slightly. "Should I be concerned?" "Possibly," he said. "The patient appears to be recovering." She smiled faintly and sat beside him on the bench. For a while they said nothing, listening to the quiet sound of water and distant machinery waking in the palace. Somewhere far above, transport platforms hummed as the first shifts of the day began. "I spoke with the council yesterday," Kyreth said at last. Nathan glanced at her. "And?" "I told them I will resume my duties gradually," she said. "Public audiences, diplomatic meetings, travel when necessary." Nathan nodded slowly. "That sounds exhausting." "It will be," she said, "but it will also be living." Nathan studied her for a moment. "You don't sound afraid." "I am," she said, "but I am no longer afraid of being seen." The words settled between them, simple and steady. A small mechanical insect drifted past, scanning the air for pollen density. Nathan watched it for a moment, then said, "I will miss this place when you start attending meetings again." "You can still come here," Kyreth said. "I know," he said. "But gardens feel different when they become official spaces instead of refuges." Kyreth considered that, then said quietly, "This will always be a refuge." They fell silent again. After a while, Nathan said, "Do you remember the first day I came here?" "Yes," she said. I was convinced I would say something foolish, he admitted. You did, she said calmly. Nathan blinked. I did? You told me the plants were probably plotting political sabotage. Nathan sighed. I stand by that assessment. I've never trusted flowers. Kyreth laughed softly, and the sound carried easily in the morning air. The laughter faded, and a quieter mood returned. I should tell you something, she said. Nathan turned toward her. When I stopped speaking, Kyreth said slowly, I believed I was protecting myself. I believed silence made me invisible. She looked at the stream, watching the light ripple across the water. But silence did something else, she continued. It made the world smaller. Each day became the same as the last. I was safe, but I was also gone. Nathan listened without speaking. And then you came, she said, and you spoke to me as if I were still here. Nathan shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the weight of her words. I only said what I saw. Yes, she said. That is what mattered. A breeze moved through the garden, carrying the faint scent of resin blossoms. Above them, the dome adjusted its transparency, revealing a pale blue sky streaked with high, thin clouds. Nathan leaned back, looking upward. You know, he said, I once read that stars are visible long after they have died. Their light keeps traveling. Kyreth followed his gaze. And you find that comforting? In a way, he said, it means that what exists leaves a trace. Even silence leaves a trace. Kyreth was quiet for a moment. I do not want to leave only silence, she said. You won't, Nathan said. They sat together until the sun rose fully, the garden brightening around them. At last Kyreth stood. I must go, she said. There is a meeting in an hour, and I have been warned that diplomats become anxious if kept waiting. Nathan rose as well. A dangerous condition, he said. I've treated it before. The only known cure is patience, which makes it notoriously difficult to administer. Kyreth smiled. They walked toward the exit together, then paused at the threshold where the garden met the corridor. Will you continue your work here? She asked. Yes, Nathan said. There are always more patients, more complaints about gravity, more translation devices to be swallowed. Kyreth hesitated, then said, I am glad. Nathan looked at her. So am I. For a moment, neither of them moved. The corridor beyond was quiet, the lights shifting gently as the palace awakened. Thank you, Kyreth said softly. Nathan smiled. You've already said that once. I know, she said, but I meant it differently this time. He inclined his head, understanding. Kyreth turned and walked down the corridor, her steps steady, her posture unguarded. She did not look back. Nathan remained at the doorway of the garden for a while, listening to the faint sounds of the palace, the hum of distant engines, the murmur of voices beginning another day. He realized then that something had changed in him as well. For years he had treated illness, repaired damage, restored function. He had believed that healing was a matter of technique, knowledge, precision. But here in a quiet garden on a distant world, he had learned something else. Sometimes healing began not with medicine, but with seeing. Nathan turned back toward the stream, watching the sunlight move across the water, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that the world, vast, strange, and endlessly complicated, was also, in its own quiet way, whole.